17 years on death row led to one final moment that stunned even the people watching from behind the glass. When Steven Corey Bryant chose the firing squad, most assumed it was just another grim formality. But what happened in the hours before his execution, and the reason he reached that point at all, was far more disturbing than anyone expected. Because Bryant wasn't just another inmate waiting out his sentence. His story is a trail of fear, cruelty, and decisions that left an entire community shaken.
That evening.
And it all ended in a way that raised one question no one was ready to answer. Everything shifted the moment Steven Corey Bryant's final appeal collapsed. On October 14, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his last attempt to avoid the death sentence he'd been fighting for nearly 2 decades. And just like that, the clock started ticking. South Carolina officials moved fast, much faster than anyone expected. Within days, the Attorney General filed the order, and Bryant was officially given the date that would end his life. Under state law, the execution had to be scheduled for the 4th Friday after he received the notice, which locked in November 14, 2025. Bryant didn't protest, didn't stall, didn't ask for extra time. Instead, he made a choice that caught even veteran officers off guard. When they handed him the form, he didn't hesitate. He selected the firing squad. South Carolina had only recently brought that method back, and almost no one chose it. For Bryant, though, it was deliberate, calm, almost calculated. And while that decision raised more questions than answers, the truth is that the events leading up to this moment had been spiraling long before the date was set. Because the countdown wasn't the beginning of his story. It was the final chord in something far darker that started years earlier, and left a trail no one could forget. Before anyone realized what was happening, Steven Corey Bryant went from an ordinary 23-year-old to the center of a storm that no one in Sumter County saw coming. He'd grown up fishing the backroads, working steady jobs, and blending into the quiet rhythm of rural life. To the people around him, he was just another young guy trying to get by. That's why what happened next felt so unreal. In early October 2004, something inside him snapped. Friends later said there were no warning signs, no sudden breakdowns, no strange outbursts. One week he was talking about weekend plans, and the next he was moving through the county like a ghost, leaving behind scenes that didn't match the man they thought they knew. It wasn't a slow build or a series of small red flags. It was an abrupt, violent shift. Over the course of just 8 days, Bryant went from quiet loner to the region's most feared name, and the speed of that transformation made the fear spread even faster. People didn't know what triggered it, but they knew one thing instantly. Whoever was behind the attacks wasn't acting out of desperation. He was acting with purpose. And the moment his first victim survived, authorities realized they weren't dealing with a passing incident. They were facing the beginning of a rampage that would push the entire community into panic. Bryant's descent started quietly, almost without warning. On October 8, 2004, he went to a familiar riverbank where locals spent their evenings fishing. Out of nowhere, he targeted 56-year-old Clinton Brown, a man he'd never met, hitting him from behind and leaving him to fend for himself in the dark. Brown survived long enough to reach help, but the randomness of the attack sent shockwaves through the small community. No motive, no warning, just a violent strike that made people realize something was terribly wrong. And the fear only grew stronger the next day. On October 9, Bryant turned on someone even closer, his friend and coworker Clifton Gay. The two men had spent years fishing together, hanging around each other's families, and giving no sign of conflict. But during what should have been a routine beer run, Bryant pulled out a stolen weapon and ended Gay's life without hesitation, leaving his body on a remote road. Investigators would later say the betrayal stunned them more than the brutality. It suggested that whatever was happening inside Bryant had already spiraled far beyond logic. What no one knew then was that these two attacks weren't isolated moments. They were simply the opening acts of something far darker, because Bryant hadn't reached the peak of his violence yet. The most disturbing incident was still ahead, and it would change everything. 2 days after the first attacks, Bryant walked up to a small home tucked deep in the quiet backroads of Sumter County. The man inside, 62-year-old Willard Teachin, had never met him. There was no connection, no argument, nothing that explained why Bryant chose that house. He simply knocked on the door, pretending he needed help. And once he was inside, the situation turned into the most disturbing moment of his entire spree. Investigators later said this was the crime that changed everything. It wasn't just another killing, it revealed the mindset behind his rampage. Teachin was targeted with a level of cold intent that sent a chill through everyone who reviewed the case. But what truly stunned detectives wasn't what happened inside the house. It was what came from the phone that kept ringing as Bryant searched the rooms. Teachin's daughter, Kimberly, called from out of state after failing to reach her father earlier in the day. No one answered the first time. But on her second attempt, a voice she didn't recognize picked up. When she said who she was, the man on the other end replied with a phrase she would never forget. "You can't talk to him. I'm the prowler." Then came the words that froze her in place. His abrupt confession delivered with a cold laugh before the line went silent. That call became the centerpiece of the investigation. And when officers arrived at the scene, they found taunting messages scrawled across the walls, signs that Bryant wanted to be noticed, maybe even hunted. From that moment forward, police knew they weren't dealing with random violence anymore. They were up against someone who wanted an audience. Someone who was escalating fast. And his spree wasn't over yet. Just when investigators thought Bryant might go into hiding, he struck again. On October 13, 2004, he walked into a small convenience store in rural Sumter County, acting calm, casual, almost friendly. Inside, he ran into 35-year-old Christopher Earl Burgess, someone he knew only in passing. They talked for a moment, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that hinted at danger. When Bryant offered him a ride, Burgess had no reason to say no. Minutes later, on a stretch of lonely road, Bryant pulled out a gun and ended Burgess's life with 2 quick shots before leaving him in a roadside ditch. There was no attempt to hide the body, no effort to cover his tracks. It was as if he didn't care who found it, or how quickly they figured out who was behind it. And they found it fast. A hunter passing through the area spotted the body less than 2 hours later and alerted authorities. With the county already on edge, the discovery sent law enforcement into overdrive. This time, they moved with precision. Witness reports, stolen items, and evidence from the earlier scenes were already pointing in one direction. Now they had confirmation. Later that same day, officers surrounded Bryant at his girlfriend's house. He didn't run, didn't resist, didn't act surprised. In fact, investigators said he seemed almost detached, as if the entire 8-day spree had already played out in his mind long before they showed up. Inside the home, police found stolen firearms, valuables taken from victims, and clothing tied to earlier attacks. Every piece of evidence tightened the case around him. Bryant's rampage was over, but the violence itself hadn't stopped. Because once he was behind bars, a new pattern began unfolding, one that would leave the courts with little doubt about the sentence he would later receive. Jail didn't slow Steven Corey Bryant down. Even after his arrest, the violence that marked his 8-day rampage followed him straight into the Sumter Lee Regional Detention Center. In October 2005, while he was still waiting for his trial to begin, Bryant turned on a correctional officer without warning. He knocked the officer to the ground and kept swinging long after the man was defenseless. For investigators, this attack wasn't just another charge. It painted a clearer picture of the person they were dealing with. Prosecutors later said it reinforced a pattern they had been building from day one. Bryant wasn't acting out of panic or confusion. His actions in and out of custody showed a level of aggression that never seemed to fade. And while the courts prepared for the capital trial, Bryant's behavior behind bars became one more piece of the story the jury would eventually hear, one that would help them understand why the state pushed for the harshest sentence available. Because the moment the trial began, it was clear that his fate was heading in only one direction. Joseph Corcoran's death sentence was supposed to bring closure, but instead it launched Indiana into one of the longest, most tangled legal battles in the state's history. What looked final in 1999 quickly unraveled, turning his case into a revolving door of appeals, reversals, and courtroom debates that dragged on for more than 2 decades. The first shock came just a year after sentencing, when the Indiana Supreme Court vacated his death penalty, arguing that the trial judge had relied on improper factors during sentencing. It didn't change Joseph's guilt, but it cracked open the door just wide enough for years of challenges to pour through. In 2002, the case returned to Judge Gull, who reviewed the evidence again and reached the same conclusion. Joseph had acted with intent. She reinstated 4 new death sentences, setting off another chain reaction of appeals. Between 2005 and 2007, Joseph's attorneys launched a full assault on the conviction. They accused prosecutors of pushing him toward a plea deal by threatening the death penalty, claiming the state had crossed ethical lines. For a moment, it looked like they had won, because in 2007, a federal judge agreed and threw out the death sentence again. But that victory was short-lived. In 2008, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated it once more, ruling the prosecution had acted within its authority. The back and forth felt endless, with every court ruling followed by another challenge, another hearing, another round of arguments about whether Joseph's mind made him unfit to die, or whether his crimes outweighed every other consideration. Even the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in not once, but twice, ordering lower courts to re-examine parts of the case. Yet each time, after the dust settled, the death sentence remained standing. Judges acknowledged he lived with delusions, heard voices, and fought battles no one else could see, but legally, he was still considered responsible for his actions. By 2016, almost 20 years after the murders, the final gavel came down. The Supreme Court declined to hear his last petition. Joseph Corcoran's legal avenues officially ran dry. But even then, the state still couldn't carry out the sentence. Indiana had gone years without the necessary drugs for lethal injection, and executions had quietly stalled. Joseph remained on death row, locked in a cell with nothing but time, while the justice system that condemned him sat frozen. What no one knew then was that Indiana was already preparing to restart what it had paused. And when the death chamber finally opened again, the state had only one name at the top of the list. For more than a decade, Indiana's death chamber stood silent. Executions had ground to a halt, not for lack of convicted criminals, but because the state simply couldn't get its hands on the drugs it needed. Then, in 2024, everything shifted. The state announced it had secured a supply of pentobarbital again, and with it came a chilling decision: they would resume capital punishment. When authorities picked the first man to die, they didn't choose a high-profile drug lord or a national criminal mastermind. They picked Joseph Corcoran. Why him? Because his case wasn't just about murder, it was about the system. For politicians, prosecutors, and many in the public, Corcoran represented a perfect storm. Guilt proved, sanity questioned, and appeals exhausted. Attorney General Todd Rokita went public, announcing that Indiana would move forward. Justice must be done, he said, framing Corcoran's execution not only as retribution, but as a symbol. He argued Corcoran finally paid his debt to society. But not everyone agreed. For his sister, Kelly, it was agonizing. She lost her brother, her fiancé, and now, even as her brother was set to die, she said she felt no peace. He was sick, she insisted. We failed him long before this moment. Behind the political rhetoric and legal certainty, the debate took on a deeper, darker dimension. Was this execution about justice, or control? Because as the resurrection of Indiana's death penalty began, Corcoran's story became more than just a criminal case. It became
on death
a
row
referendum
without
on mental
receiving
illness,
any
on
visits
a
from
system
family
that
members.
many argued
He
condemned
spent
a
that
broken
time
mind
almost
without ever
entirely
truly understanding it. December 17, 2024, was the day Joseph Corcoran's life would finally reach its end. After more than 25 years behind bars, after decades of appeals, hearings, and courtroom battles, there was no longer any legal avenue left. The prison knew it would be a long, controlled day, but nothing could remove the weight in the air. Joseph's final hours were oddly calm. When prison officials told him every appeal had failed, he nodded quietly and said, "I understand." There was no anger, no panic, no pleading, just a strange, eerie acceptance. Around him, everything was methodical: checks, protocols, and preparations, all to ensure the final act would unfold without incident. His last meal was simple: a pint of ice cream, slowly eaten as he stared blankly at the wall. He then received his final visits, including one with the woman he married from death row after years of letters. They pressed their palms to the reinforced glass, separated by inches but divided by fate. He told her softly, "You don't have to cry. It's okay. I've made peace." Later, he met briefly with his attorney, who made one last plea for clemency. Joseph refused, saying he didn't want to fight anymore. Exhausted, he signed a short note: "Thank you for everything. Don't be sad." As midnight approached, he walked calmly to the execution chamber. Strapped to the gurney under harsh fluorescent lights, he looked detached, almost distant, as a handful of witnesses observed. When asked for final words, his voice was flat: "Not really. Let's get this over with." At 12:36 a.m., the lethal injection began. Within minutes, his chest rose and fell more slowly. His lips parted, and at 12:44 a.m., the doctor pronounced Joseph Corcoran dead. Outside the walls of Indiana State Prison, dawn was breaking. For some, justice had been served. For others, a tragedy had ended. For Joseph Corcoran, after decades of obsession, paranoia, and violence, it was over. But the questions his life and death left behind, about justice, mental illness, and the system that failed him, refused to disappear. Joseph Corcoran is gone, executed after a lifetime marked by tragedy, obsession, and violence. But even now, the story refuses to be simple. Was he a cold, calculating killer who deserved every second of his sentence? Or was he a man whose mind had long since turned against him, haunted by voices no one else could hear, trapped in a world of paranoia and delusion? Indiana's decision to carry out his execution ended a decades-long legal battle, but it didn't answer the deeper questions. Could the system have intervened sooner? Could mental illness have been treated before it became deadly? And for the families left behind, does punishment ever truly bring closure, or just reopen old wounds? Joseph Corcoran's life, his crimes, and his death force us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, mercy, and the limits of human understanding. In the end, his story isn't just about one man. It's a mirror reflecting the fragile line between guilt and madness, between law and compassion. And that question, the one that lingers long after the last gurney is cleaned and the prison doors close, is one we may never fully answer. By September 2008, nearly 4 years after his arrest, Steven Corey Bryant finally faced the courtroom. The trial was intense, a careful dance between the defense trying to humanize him and the prosecution laying out a trail of cold, calculated violence. Bryant's attorneys painted a picture of trauma and long-term abuse, arguing that systemic failures had shaped the man he had become. They emphasized his history, hoping to sway the jury away from the death penalty. But the prosecution's case was unrelenting. They highlighted the 8-day rampage, the betrayal of his friend, the terrifying acts against strangers, and the relentless violence even behind bars. Each piece of evidence painted Bryant not as a troubled young man, but as someone who acted with chilling precision and disregard for human life. On September 11, 2008, the jury reached its verdict. Bryant was found guilty of capital murder for the death of Willard Teachin, the case that shocked the county the most. He was sentenced to death for that killing, and life sentences for the murders of Clifton Gay and Christopher Burgess, along with nearly 100 additional years for his other crimes. Over the next 16 years and 9 months, Bryant used every legal avenue available to fight the sentence. Appeals were filed, arguments debated, and deadlines met, but nothing could overturn the outcome. Finally, on October 14, 2025, the Supreme Court rejected his last appeal, clearing the path for his execution and ending nearly 2 decades of legal battles. With the trial behind him and the appeals exhausted, Bryant's final days were approaching, and the end would come faster than anyone expected. Once the Supreme Court rejected his final appeal, the countdown was real. On October 17, 2025, Steven Corey Bryant received the official order setting his execution for November 14. He was given a choice of method, a rare decision in South Carolina, and he picked the firing squad, becoming only the 3rd inmate to do so since executions resumed in 2024. Bryant spent his final days almost entirely alone. Family visits never came. Instead, his contact was limited to prison staff and a spiritual advisor who offered guidance in those final hours. There were no distractions, no last-minute plans, only the slow, quiet passage of time, measured by routine and reflection. On the morning of November 14, he woke at 4 a.m. showered. Met briefly with his spiritual counselor. Sedatives were administered to calm his nerves, standard procedure before a firing squad execution. Each step was methodical, deliberate, marking a stark contrast to the chaotic rampage that had defined his youth. And yet, even in these final days, questions lingered. Why had he chosen this method? What had gone through his mind in the long hours of solitude? And most importantly, how did a man capable of such violence come to sit quietly, awaiting a chamber he could neither escape nor control? The answer would come soon, and the world would watch as the final chapter of Steven Corey Bryant's story began. By late afternoon on November 14, 2025, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. At 5:45 p.m., Steven Corey Bryant was escorted from his cell to the execution chamber. Leather straps secured him to the chair, a hood was placed over his head, and the target was positioned over his chest. The warden read the execution order aloud as witnesses settled behind the bulletproof glass. Minutes later, at 6:10 p.m., the firing squad acted. 3 shooters fired simultaneously. The chamber was silent except for the sharp report of the rifles, and within seconds, neurological death likely occurred. Reflexive movements and involuntary sounds followed, but the process was swift, controlled, and final. At 6:20 p.m., the coroner pronounced Steven Corey Bryant dead. He had offered no final words, no explanation, just silence marking the end of nearly 2 decades of legal battles and a lifetime defined by fear and violence. And with that, the story of the man who had terrorized a county, betrayed friends, and left a trail of destruction finally came to its last, irrevocable chapter. Steven Corey Bryant's story ended behind a firing squad, but the questions it raises linger far beyond the walls of a prison. How does a young man go from quiet, everyday life to a week of terror that shakes an entire community? Can justice ever truly balance the scale after such calculated cruelty? And when the legal system finally closes the book, what does the legacy of fear, loss, and unanswered questions leave behind for the people who survived, and for the society that watched it all unfold? His rampage, his trial, and his final days force us to confront the limits of justice, the consequences of unchecked violence, and the fragility of life in the hands of someone who chooses cruelty. The execution may have closed the final chapter, but the echoes of his actions, and the debates they ignite, will remain for years to come. What do you think? Was this a just ending, or does the story leave more questions than answers?